The gavel struck the table so hard that the water glasses shook, but Draven Ashworth did not flinch, because he never heard the sound at all. He watched the mouths of the council move instead, reading the shapes of their words the way other men read newspapers, and what he read on their lips that morning was a death sentence wrapped in polite language. 30 days, they told him. Marry an outsider within 30 days. Prove that a deaf alpha could still bind a mate and hold a pack together. Or step aside and let his cousin Roland take the crown that had belonged to the Ashworth line for 6 generations. Draven set his jaw and did not argue, because arguing with men who already believed he was broken would only prove their point. He had been alpha for 3 years. He had led hunts, settled disputes between farming families, and kept the northern border quiet, without a single life lost, all without hearing a single warning growl or shouted command, because he had trained himself to feel vibration through the ground and read every face in a room before it finished forming an expression. None of that mattered to the council now. They wanted a wife. They wanted proof that he was still a whole man, still worth following, still capable of producing an heir who would carry on a strong bloodline instead of a broken one. Corin, his translator and the closest thing he had to a friend, signed the terms again slowly, his hands steady even though his face was tight with worry. Draven signed back a single word. Fine. He did not intend to fall in love. He intended to walk into the city, find a woman desperate enough to accept a marriage of convenience, pay her well, and return to ruling his pack in peace once the 30 days had passed, and the council had nothing left to say. The city outside pack territory was loud, in ways Draven could not hear, but could feel in his chest. Buses grinding against pavement, crowds shifting like tides, 100 small vibrations rolling up through his boots. He walked through it with Corin at his side, scanning faces, looking for someone who looked tired enough, poor enough, desperate enough, to say yes to a stranger's ring. That was when he saw her. Mira Calloway was standing outside a hospital in a nurse's uniform that had seen 100 double shifts, arguing quietly but firmly, with a billing clerk through a glass window, her shoulders squared, even though exhaustion sat heavy under her eyes. She did not look desperate. She looked like a woman who refused to be pushed over, even when the world was pushing hard. Draven watched her mouth move as she spoke, watched the clerk shake his head, watched Mira's jaw tighten the exact same way his own did when he was fighting to stay calm. He did not know why he stopped walking. He only knew that something about her steadiness pulled at him the way gravity pulls at falling water, and before he could think better of it, he asked Corin to approach her. Mira turned when Corin tapped her shoulder, and her eyes moved first to Corin, then to the tall, silent man standing a few steps behind him, watching her with an intensity that should have felt uncomfortable, but instead felt oddly honest. Corin explained quickly. Alpha Draven Ashworth needed a wife within 30 days to keep his throne. The marriage would be real on paper, generous in payment, and required nothing from her but her signature and her presence at his side in public. In exchange, any debt she carried would vanish. Mira's first instinct was to laugh, because it sounded like something from a story her patients told her to pass the time during long recoveries. Then she thought of her mother's hospital bill sitting unpaid on her kitchen counter, growing larger every month, threatening to swallow the small apartment they shared, and the laugh died in her throat. She studied the silent man again. He was watching her lips with a focus so complete that she felt seen in a way she rarely felt by anyone, seen not for her uniform or her tired eyes, but for the actual words coming out of her mouth. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, mostly to Corin, though her eyes stayed on Draven. Corin translated the question with his hands, and Draven answered the same way, his fingers moving with a calm certainty that surprised her. Corin spoke the words aloud a moment later. He said he needs a wife, not a performance. He said if you accept, he will treat you with respect, and if you want to leave after the 30 days, he will let you go without a fight. Mira looked at her own reflection in the hospital's glass door, at the tired young woman staring back at her, and made a decision that would change everything that came after. She said yes. The wedding happened 4 days later, quiet and small, held in a stone hall inside pack territory that smelled of pine and old smoke. Mira wore a simple dress that Corin had chosen for her, and Draven wore the formal coat of the Ashworth line, heavy with embroidery that told the history of a family older than the city she had grown up in. She did not expect to feel anything standing across from him. As an elder spoke words neither of them could hear the same way. Draven reading lips, Mira listening to a language of ceremony that felt both ancient and strange. But when Draven reached for her hand and signed a simple word that Corin quietly translated as "thank you," something in her chest tightened in a way she did not have a name for yet. The council watched from the front row, with expressions ranging from satisfaction to barely hidden contempt. Roland, Draven's cousin, sat among them with a smile that did not reach his eyes, a smile Mira would come to recognize later as the mask of a man already counting the days until this marriage failed. After the ceremony, Mira was led through the Pack estate by a woman named Alira, a stern housekeeper who explained the rules of the house in short clipped sentences, as though she resented having to explain anything at all. Mira listened carefully, filing away every detail, because she had learned long ago that surviving unfamiliar places meant paying attention to everything. That night, alone in a guest room larger than her entire apartment back in the city, Mira sat by the window and watched the Pack territory settle into darkness, distant lights flickering between the trees like slow-moving stars. She thought about the debt now gone from her mother's account, the relief that should have flooded her, and instead found herself thinking about the silent man who had watched her lips so carefully outside a hospital, as though her words were the only sound in the world worth catching. She did not know yet about the enemies circling him, the cousin waiting to seize the throne, or the injury behind his ear that had never fully healed the way the doctors said it should have. She only knew that something about Draven Ashworth felt like a puzzle she could not stop wanting to solve, and in the morning, when Corin came to fetch her for her first official appearance as Alpha Draven's wife, she found herself looking forward to seeing him again, far more than she was willing to admit. Down the hall, Draven stood at his own window, watching the same darkness settle over the same trees, his fingers absently tracing the old scar behind his ear, the one that ached sometimes in the quiet hours when the rest of the world had gone still. He did not know why it ached tonight more than most nights. He only knew that something had shifted the moment Mira Calloway said yes, and whether that shift would save him or destroy him, he could not yet tell. Roland, watching from a window in the east wing, smiled into the darkness and made a quiet call on a line no one in the estate knew existed, confirming that the wedding had happened exactly as planned, and that the next phase of his own plan could now begin. The next morning arrived with a pale gray light that spread slowly across the estate grounds, and Mira woke to the sound of birds she could not name, a sound that felt strange after years of waking to ambulance sirens and the hum of hospital machines. For a moment she forgot where she was, and then the weight of the ring on her finger reminded her. Alira arrived at her door with a plain but well-made dress draped over one arm, along with instructions delivered in the same clipped tone as the night before. The Alpha's wife would join him for the morning gathering, where the Pack elders and senior members would see her for the first time, as more than a rumor. Mira dressed quickly, smoothing the fabric with hands that were not quite steady, and reminded herself that she had faced angry patients, exhausted doctors, and impossible hospital politics without flinching. A room full of strangers would not be the thing that broke her composure. Draven was waiting at the base of the stairs when she came down, dressed simply but sharply, his expression unreadable in the way she was already learning to recognize as careful control rather than coldness. He watched her descend the steps, his eyes following her mouth as she offered a quiet good morning, and something in his shoulders eased slightly, as though he had been bracing for her to have changed her mind overnight. Corin joined them a moment later, his hands already moving to explain the plan for the gathering. Draven would introduce her formally. She would not be expected to speak at length, only to stand beside him and let the Pack see that the marriage was real. Questions, if there were any, would come later, and could be handled carefully. Mira nodded, though her stomach tightened at the thought of dozens of unfamiliar eyes studying her, searching for weakness, searching for a reason to dismiss her as nothing more than a desperate outsider who had married a broken king for money. The gathering hall was already filling when they arrived, tall windows letting in long beams of morning light that fell across rows of Pack members seated on wooden benches, murmuring among themselves until Draven stepped through the doorway, and the room fell into an immediate, practiced silence. Mira felt the weight of that silence settle over her like a second dress, heavier than the first. Draven did not speak, because speaking aloud was not something he trusted himself to do with the same confidence as signing, but he did not need to. He simply took Mira's hand, raised it slightly so the room could see the ring on her finger, and let Corin's voice carry the words that his hands had already shaped. "This is Mira Ashworth, my wife. Treat her with the respect you would show any member of this pack." A ripple moved through the crowd, some faces open with curiosity, others closed off with suspicion, and a few, mostly near the back where Roland's allies tended to sit, wearing expressions of thinly disguised scorn. Mira held her chin level and let her eyes move slowly across the room, meeting gazes instead of avoiding them, the same way she had learned to hold her ground during chaotic hospital shifts, when everyone around her was shouting, and only calm, steady eyes kept the room from tipping into panic. After the gathering ended, an older woman approached her near the doors, introducing herself as Talia, one of the pack's healers. Talia's eyes were kind but sharp, taking in details the way Mira herself often studied a patient before asking a single question. "You are a nurse," Talia said, more statement than question. Mira nodded, surprised that word had already spread. "Good," Talia said. "This pack could use someone who understands healing as more than herbs and old traditions. Perhaps you and I will have reason to work together." Mira thanked her, grateful for the first genuinely warm interaction since arriving, and watched Talia disappear into the crowd with the easy confidence of someone who had spent decades belonging exactly where she stood. Later that afternoon, Mira found herself wandering the estate gardens alone, needing air and space after the tension of the morning. She discovered Draven sitting on a stone bench near a small fountain, his eyes closed, his fingers resting lightly against the side of his head near his ear, in a gesture she was beginning to recognize as habitual, almost unconscious. She approached slowly, making sure her shadow crossed his line of sight before she got close enough to startle him, a habit she had already adopted without being told, simply from paying attention to how he moved through the world. He opened his eyes and offered a small, tired smile, gesturing for her to sit. They sat together in silence for a while, a silence that should have felt awkward between two strangers, bound together by a contract, but instead felt strangely comfortable, the kind of quiet that asked for nothing and demanded nothing in return. Mira found herself studying the side of his face, the faint scar that traced down from behind his ear, and wondered, not for the first time, exactly what kind of accident had taken his hearing and left a mark that still seemed to bother him more than 3 years later. She did not ask, not yet, but the question settled into her mind and stayed there, quiet and patient, waiting for the moment it would finally demand an answer. A week into the marriage, Mira woke to shouting in the hallway outside her room, sharp voices, arguing about something she could not make out through the thick wooden door, and by the time she pulled on a robe and stepped into the corridor, 2 guards were already escorting a furious kitchen worker away, while Alira stood, with her arms crossed, watching the scene with a tight, unreadable expression. Mira asked what happened, and Alira's answer was clipped, almost dismissive. A theft in the kitchen stores, nothing more. Nothing for the Alpha's wife to worry about. But something in the housekeeper's tone told Mira there was more to the story than a simple theft, and she filed the moment away with all the other small, strange details that had started collecting since her arrival. Life inside the estate had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Mornings began with quiet breakfasts, where Draven read reports through Corin's steady hands, afternoons filled with Mira learning the pack's customs from Talia, and evenings often found the two of them sitting together in comfortable silence, slowly becoming less like strangers, and more like two people who happened to share a home. Mira had started learning basic sign language almost by accident, picking up a few words from Corin during idle moments, then a few more, until she found herself practicing simple phrases alone in her room at night, determined to reach a point where she would not always need a translator standing between herself and her own husband. The first time she signed a full sentence to Draven without Corin's help, asking simply if he had eaten breakfast, his eyes widened with a surprise so genuine and unguarded that Mira felt something warm bloom in her chest. He signed back slowly, patiently, correcting her hand shape with gentle guidance rather than criticism, and for the first time since the wedding, the estate felt less like a cage and more like a place she might actually choose to stay. But not everyone welcomed the growing closeness between them. Corin, watching from across the room during one of these quiet lessons, wore an expression that flickered between relief and something darker. something Mira could not quite name. She noticed it more than once, the way his jaw tightened whenever Draven and Mira communicated directly, bypassing him entirely, and she wondered whether Corin's loyalty to Draven was as simple and uncomplicated as it appeared on the surface. Roland, meanwhile, had not disappeared after the wedding, only retreated to the edges of pack life, where he could watch and wait, without drawing attention. Mira first noticed him properly during a formal dinner, held to mark 2 weeks of the marriage, when his eyes lingered on her a moment too long, before sliding to Draven, with an expression of practiced concern. "How is married life treating you, cousin?" Roland asked, his voice smooth, pitched just loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. Draven read the question off his lips and answered evenly through Corin's translation, saying only that he had no complaints. Roland smiled, the expression not quite reaching his eyes, and turned his attention to Mira instead. "And you, Mira," he said, drawing her name out slightly longer than necessary. "Do you find our alpha attentive enough, given his particular limitations?" The comment landed exactly as intended, sharp beneath its polite surface, and several guests near enough to hear went suddenly quiet, waiting to see how Mira would respond. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment but from anger, the same protective anger she felt whenever a patient's family spoke over a patient, as though they were not in the room at all. "Draven's limitations," she said clearly, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "have nothing to do with his ability to lead, and everything to do with people who mistake silence for weakness, because they have never had to listen as carefully as he does." The table fell into a heavier silence, and Roland's smile thinned at the edges, though he covered the moment quickly with a short laugh and a dismissive wave of his hand, claiming he meant no offense. Draven, catching only fragments of the exchange from Mira's expression and the tension in the room, asked Corin quietly what had been said. Corin hesitated before translating, but eventually gave an honest account, and Mira watched something shift behind Draven's eyes as he understood what his cousin had implied and how his wife had answered. Later that night, after the dinner guests had gone, Draven found Mira in the garden again, sitting near the same fountain where they had first shared comfortable silence. He sat beside her without a word, then signed slowly, "Thank you for tonight." Mira signed back as best she could. "You did not need defending, but I was not going to let him speak about you like that." Draven studied her for a long moment, his expression unusually open, and then signed something Corin was not present to translate, something Mira did not fully understand, though the warmth in his eyes told her enough. She reached over and squeezed his hand gently, and for once, neither of them needed words at all. Over the following days, Mira began noticing small, strange details about Draven that nagged at the edges of her nursing instincts. He would sometimes flinch at moments when nothing visible had happened nearby, his head turning sharply toward an empty hallway, as though startled by something only he had sensed. Once, during a quiet afternoon in the study, she watched him press his palm flat against the side of his head near his ear, wincing slightly, then quickly composing his expression when he noticed her watching. She asked him about it gently, using the signs she had learned along with careful, patient gestures. "Does your ear hurt?" He hesitated before answering, his fingers moving slowly. "Sometimes. An old injury. It is nothing." But Mira had spent years working in a hospital, had learned to recognize the difference between a patient downplaying real pain and a patient who genuinely had nothing wrong, and something about the way Draven avoided her eyes told her this was the former, not the latter. She did not push further that day, sensing that trust between them was still fragile, still new, still something that needed to be built slowly rather than forced. But she began watching more closely, noticing the pattern of his discomfort, the way it seemed worse in the evenings, worse when the estate grew quiet, worse in ways that did not quite match the explanation of an old, healed injury. Talia, during one of their afternoon conversations in the healer's quiet workroom, filled with dried herbs and neatly labeled jars, mentioned almost in passing that Draven's original injury 3 years ago had been treated hastily, by healers loyal to the previous Alpha Council, rather than by Talia herself, who had only joined the Pack's healing staff shortly afterward. She said it carefully, as though choosing her words with deliberate caution, and Mira sensed there was more beneath the comment than Talia was willing to say outright. That night, Mira lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling, turning over everything she had noticed since arriving. The flinching, The pain that came and went with strange patterns. The hurried, unfamiliar treatment after the original accident. Roland's constant, careful presence at the edges of every gathering, watching, waiting, smiling his thin smile. None of it fit neatly together yet, but Mira had learned long ago that when enough small details refused to make sense on their own, it usually meant a larger picture was hiding, just out of view, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. She closed her eyes and made a quiet promise to herself. Whatever was happening beneath the surface of this pack, whatever secret Draven's old injury was hiding, she intended to find it, one careful observation at a time. The following morning brought a request from Talia, asking Mira to help organize the healer's storeroom, a task that on the surface seemed simple, but which Mira suspected was Talia's way of offering more private time to talk, without Alira or Corin listening nearby. The storeroom smelled of dried lavender, and something sharper underneath, medicinal herbs stacked in neat rows along wooden shelves that had clearly been maintained with great care for many years. As they worked, sorting jars and checking labels, Talia spoke carefully about the pack's history, choosing her words the way someone chooses footing on unstable ground. She explained that before Draven's accident, the pack had been led with a firm but fair hand, and that his father, the previous Alpha, had trusted very few people outside his immediate family with matters of security. When the accident happened, the pack had been thrown into chaos, and in that chaos, certain decisions had been made quickly, without the careful oversight that normally would have accompanied something so serious. Mira asked, as gently as she could, what exactly Talia meant by decisions made quickly. Talia paused, a jar of dried chamomile held loosely in her hands, and admitted that she had not been present for the accident itself, having joined the healing staff only in its aftermath, but that she had heard whispers over the years, fragments of conversation from older pack members, who remembered things differently than the official account described. The official account, Talia explained, stated that Draven had been injured during a border skirmish, struck hard enough near the head to damage his hearing permanently. But Talia had heard, more than once, careful mentions of strange circumstances surrounding that night, details that never quite lined up with a simple battlefield injury. She did not elaborate further, and Mira sensed that pushing too hard, too fast, would only cause the older woman to retreat into cautious silence. Instead, Mira thanked her for sharing what she had, and the two women continued sorting herbs in a companionable quiet that nonetheless left Mira's mind spinning with new questions. A border skirmish that did not quite make sense. Hasty treatment from healers who were no longer part of the staff. An old injury that still caused Draven pain years later, in patterns too irregular to match simple nerve damage. That afternoon, Mira found an excuse to visit the estate's small library, a quiet room lined with old records and pack histories that Corin had once mentioned in passing. She was not entirely sure what she hoped to find, only that her instincts, honed through years of noticing small details that others overlooked, told her the library might hold pieces of the puzzle that people were unwilling to speak aloud. The records were organized by year, thick leather-bound volumes recording pack decisions, border incidents, and formal council meetings stretching back decades. Mira located the volume covering the year of Draven's accident and began carefully turning pages, searching for any mention of the incident that had cost him his hearing. She found the entry eventually, brief and oddly vague compared to the detailed records surrounding it. It noted only that Alpha Draven Ashworth had sustained an injury during border patrol duties, that his hearing had been affected, and that the matter had been handled internally by the healing staff at the time. No names were listed, no detailed account of the skirmish itself appeared anywhere in the surrounding pages, which was strange, given how thoroughly every other incident in the record seemed to be documented, down to minor property disputes between neighboring farms. Mira sat back in her chair, staring at the sparse entry, feeling the same prickling instinct she had felt countless times in the hospital when a patient's chart did not match their symptoms, when something written down did not tell the whole truth of what had actually happened to a person's body. Records that were too clean, too brief, too carefully worded, often hid more than records that were messy and detailed, because messiness usually meant honesty, and careful brevity usually meant something being deliberately smoothed over. She closed the volume gently and returned it to its shelf, aware that she had spent longer in the library than she intended, and not wanting to draw attention to her curiosity before she understood what, exactly, she was curious about. As she left, She nearly collided with Corin in the corridor outside, and something in his expression, a flicker of surprise quickly masked by his usual calm, told her he had noticed exactly where she had been. He asked, with careful politeness, whether she had found what she was looking for in the library. Mira answered just as carefully, saying only that she enjoyed reading about the pack's history, and Corin nodded, accepting the answer without further comment, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than felt entirely natural. That evening, sitting across from Draven during a quiet dinner, Mira studied him with fresh eyes, watching the way he occasionally winced when nothing in the room had made a sound she could hear, watching the careful, practiced way he avoided drawing attention to his own discomfort. She thought about the sparse record in the library, the whispers Talia had mentioned, and Roland's constant lingering presence at the edges of every gathering, smiling his careful, patient smile, and she felt certain, with the same clarity she felt when a patient's condition was about to take a sudden turn, that whatever had truly happened to Draven 3 years ago, the official story was nowhere close to the whole truth. She did not yet know how deep the truth went, or how dangerous it might be to uncover it, but she knew, watching her husband's tired, guarded eyes across the table, that she was no longer willing to let the matter rest. 3 weeks into the marriage, an alarm bell rang across the estate grounds in the middle of the night, and Mira bolted upright in bed, heart pounding, before she remembered that Draven could not hear it at all, and that somewhere in the house he was likely still asleep, unaware that anything was wrong. She threw on a robe and ran through the corridor toward his room, nearly colliding with a guard rushing the opposite direction, who shouted something about a breach at the northern fence, before continuing past her without stopping. Mira did not slow down. She reached Draven's door, pushed it open, and found him already awake, sitting upright, his hand pressed to the wall beside his bed, feeling the faint vibrations traveling through the estate's old stone foundation. He looked at her, confusion and alertness mixing on his face, and Mira quickly signed the little she knew, danger, north, before grabbing his hand and pulling him toward the door. They found Corin in the hallway moments later, already dressed, already signing rapid explanations that Mira could only partially follow. Someone had tried to cross the northern boundary fence during the night, and while the intruder had fled before being caught, the attempt itself was unusual, since pack territory had not faced a serious border incursion in over a year. Draven's expression hardened as Corin finished explaining, and he moved immediately toward the estate's security office, Mira following close behind, despite Alira's attempt to steer her back toward her room. Mira ignored the housekeeper entirely. If something dangerous was happening within these walls, she was not going to sit quietly in the dark, waiting to be told about it after the fact. The security office was a small, cluttered room, lined with maps of the territory, and boards marked with patrol schedules. Draven studied the northern boundary map, while Corin relayed reports from the guards who had responded to the alarm, and Mira watched carefully, noting how quickly and competently Draven assessed the situation, despite being unable to hear a single word being said around him, relying instead on Corin's hands, and his own sharp reading of the maps and reports laid before him. No intruder had been caught, but tracks near the fence suggested at least 2 individuals had approached before retreating, and strange scratch marks on a nearby tree suggested they had been marking the boundary for a reason no one yet understood. Draven ordered increased patrols along the northern line, and asked Corin to have the tracks examined again, at first light, by someone experienced in reading such signs. As the immediate crisis settled into careful, methodical response, Mira found herself standing near the doorway, watching Draven work, and noticed Roland arriving late to the security office, his hair slightly disheveled, his expression carefully arranged into concern that did not quite reach his eyes. He offered to personally lead the dawn patrol along the northern fence, framing the offer as loyal, helpful concern for pack safety. Draven, reading the offer off Corin's hands, studied his cousin for a long moment before agreeing, though something in his posture told Mira he accepted the offer out of necessity rather than trust. After Roland left the room, Draven signed quietly to Corin, and Corin's expression tightened before he nodded and left to relay whatever instructions Draven had given. Mira waited until the room emptied before approaching Draven directly, signing carefully, "Are you sure about him?" Draven met her eyes and answered honestly, "No. But I cannot accuse my own cousin without proof, not when half the council already looks for reasons to call me unfit." The word unfit hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them said aloud. Mira reached for his hand, holding it firmly, and Draven's shoulders relaxed slightly at the contact, though the tension in his jaw remained. Over the following days, the northern boundary incident became the estate's central topic of quiet conversation, whispered between guards and kitchen staff alike, though no further intrusions occurred, and the scratch marks on the tree were eventually dismissed by the pack's trackers as the work of ordinary wildlife, rather than anything sinister. Mira was not entirely convinced, but without evidence to the contrary, there was little she could do beyond continuing to watch and wait. During this period, her friendship with Talia deepened further, the older healer sharing more stories about pack history during their afternoons together, always carefully, always with the sense of a woman choosing her words to avoid saying too much at once. Mira, in turn, shared stories of her own life before the marriage, of long hospital shifts, and her mother's illness, of the constant financial pressure that had made Draven's offer impossible to refuse, despite how strange it had seemed at first. Talia listened with genuine warmth, and one afternoon, while examining a patient's old chart together, she mentioned almost offhandedly that the healer who had treated Draven immediately after his accident 3 years ago had left the pack entirely within a year, moving to a distant territory for reasons that were never fully explained. Mira asked for the healer's name, and Talia hesitated only briefly before answering. Bellamy Ferris, a quiet man, skilled but private, who kept mostly to himself even before he left. Mira filed the name away carefully, adding it to the small collection of details she had been gathering since her first suspicious afternoon in the library. A healer who treated the original injury and then vanished from the pack within a year. A record that gave almost no detail about the actual incident. Whispers of circumstances that did not match the official account. Roland's constant, careful presence circling the edges of every crisis. None of it proved anything yet, but the pieces were beginning to suggest a shape, faint and unclear, like a photograph slowly developing in dim light. That evening, Draven found her in the garden again, their now familiar meeting place beside the quiet fountain, and sat close enough that their shoulders touched. He signed slowly. "Thank you for staying close during the alarm last night." Mira signed back, of course, and meant it more deeply than the simple words could express. They sat together as the sky darkened, and Mira found herself studying his profile in the fading light, the scar behind his ear, catching the last traces of sun, and she made a silent decision that she would not simply wait for answers to come to her. If Roland was involved in something dangerous, if the truth about Draven's accident had been buried deliberately rather than lost to circumstance, she intended to find it herself, piece by careful piece, no matter how long it took or how much digging it required. Draven, unaware of the full weight of her thoughts, reached over and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch tender, in a way that made her chest ache, with something she was not yet ready to name. For a moment, the danger circling the edges of their lives seemed distant, and there was only the quiet garden, the fading light, and the growing, undeniable warmth building steadily between them. The next morning, Mira woke early and decided to visit the northern boundary herself, curious to see the location of the intrusion with her own eyes, rather than relying only on second-hand descriptions. She dressed warmly, since the mornings in pack territory carried a chill that reminded her nothing of the city, and asked one of the younger guards, a friendly man named Callan, if he would walk with her. Callan agreed readily, clearly flattered to be asked, and led her along a narrow forest path that wound gradually upward toward the fence line. As they walked, Mira asked careful, casual questions about the pack's usual patrol routines, and Callan answered openly, not seeming to notice that her questions were more pointed than idle curiosity would explain. He mentioned that patrol shifts near the northern boundary had been quietly rearranged about a month earlier, shortly before the wedding, with several experienced guards reassigned to other sections of the territory, and newer, less experienced guards taking their place. Mira asked who had ordered the change, and Callan shrugged, saying only that such decisions usually came from the council's security committee, which Roland had chaired for the past 2 years. The information settled into Mira's mind like a stone dropping into still water, rippling outward with implications she did not yet fully understand. If Roland controlled which guards patrolled which sections of the border, and if experienced guards had been moved away from the northern boundary shortly before an unexplained intrusion occurred there, the timing felt far too convenient to dismiss as coincidence. They reached the fence line eventually, and Callan pointed out the scratch marks on the nearby tree that the pack's trackers had dismissed as wildlife activity. Mira examined them closely, drawing on years of observing wounds and injuries with a trained eye, and found herself doubting the official explanation. The marks were too even, too deliberately spaced, more consistent with something scraped by a tool than by claws or teeth. She did not mention her doubts to Callan, not wanting to draw attention to her suspicions before she had gathered enough evidence to bring them to Draven with confidence, rather than vague unease. Instead, she thanked him for the walk and returned to the estate, her mind turning over every detail, fitting pieces together with the same careful patience she once used to diagnose a patient whose symptoms did not match the obvious explanation. By the time she reached the estate gardens again, she had made a quiet decision. She would begin keeping a private record of everything she noticed, every strange detail, every inconsistency, no matter how small, until the shape hiding beneath the surface of pack life became clear enough to name. That afternoon, she found a small notebook in the estate library and began writing, using careful, vague language in case anyone else ever read the pages. She wrote about the sparse record of the accident, about Bellamy Ferris, the healer who had vanished within a year, about the reassigned guards near the northern boundary, about Roland's timing, always present, always convenient, always wearing that same practiced concern that never reached his eyes. She hid the notebook beneath a loose floorboard she discovered near her bed, a detail she noticed purely by accident while pacing one restless evening, the board shifting slightly beneath her foot, in a way that suggested it had been loosened long before she arrived. She wondered briefly who else might have used that same hiding place over the years, and what secrets the room itself might already be holding. Dinner that evening was quieter than usual, Draven distracted by council correspondence that Corin translated in low, careful signs across the table. Mira watched the exchange, catching fragments of the conversation through Corin's hands, enough to understand that the council was pressing for a formal announcement regarding the northern boundary incident, eager to either reassure the pack or use the moment as further proof of instability under Draven's leadership. After dinner, Draven asked Mira to walk with him along the estate's outer wall, a request delivered through Corin, but clearly born from a desire for time alone with her, rather than any official purpose. They walked slowly, the evening air cool and carrying the faint scent of pine, and for a while, neither of them signed anything at all, content simply to walk side by side in comfortable silence. Eventually, Draven stopped near a section of the wall overlooking the northern fields and signed a question that surprised her with its directness. "Do you regret marrying me?" Mira considered the question carefully before answering, wanting her response to be honest rather than merely reassuring. "No," she signed slowly, "I do not regret it. I am worried about you, about what is happening here, but I do not regret choosing this." Draven studied her for a long moment, his expression difficult to read in the fading light, and then signed something that made her breath catch slightly. "I am glad it was you the council pushed me toward that day. Of all the people in that city, I am glad it was you." Mira felt heat rise in her cheeks, unexpected and unfamiliar after weeks of careful distance between them, and she reached for his hand, holding it firmly as they continued their walk along the wall. Whatever danger was circling this pack, whatever secrets waited to be uncovered about his accident 3 years ago, she found herself increasingly certain that she wanted to face it standing beside him, rather than watching from a careful distance. As they turned back toward the estate, Mira caught a brief glimpse of a figure near the tree line beyond the wall, too far away to identify clearly, watching for just a moment before disappearing into the shadows. She said nothing to Draven, not wanting to alarm him without certainty, but the sight settled uneasily in her stomach, another small detail to add to the growing collection hidden beneath the floorboard in her room. Mira found the second notebook entry harder to write than the first, because by the 4th week of her marriage, the small, strange details she had been collecting no longer felt like scattered puzzle pieces. They felt like the outline of something deliberate, something built carefully over years, and the weight of that realization pressed on her chest every time she lifted the loose floorboard to add another line. The figure she had glimpsed near the tree line the night of her walk with Draven had not appeared again, but she could not shake the feeling of being watched, a sensation that followed her through the estate corridors and lingered even in the quiet safety of the garden. She mentioned it once to Talia, carefully, framing it as unease rather than certainty, and the older healer's expression flickered with something close to alarm before she composed herself and suggested Mira simply needed more rest after weeks of adjusting to unfamiliar surroundings. Mira did not believe that explanation, but she let it stand, unwilling to push Talia further, before she had gathered enough evidence to justify the pressure. The council summoned Draven for an emergency session, 8 days after the Northern Boundary incident, demanding a full report on the pack's security measures. Mira was not permitted to attend, a rule Illyra delivered with clear satisfaction, but she waited near the council chamber doors regardless, watching faces as members filed out afterward, reading tension and frustration in expressions that told her more than any official summary would have. Roland emerged from the chamber looking pleased in a way he did not bother to fully hide, exchanging quiet words with 2 other council members, before noticing Mira waiting nearby. His smile widened as he approached her, the same practiced warmth that never reached his eyes. "Quite a dramatic first month for you," he said, his tone light, almost teasing. "Intruders at the border, a husband who cannot hear them coming. You must wonder sometimes whether you made the right choice." Mira held his gaze steadily, refusing to let the comment rattle her composure. "I made exactly the right choice," she said evenly. "Draven leads this pack better with his eyes and his patience than most men lead with their ears and their tempers." Something flickered behind Roland's eyes at that, gone almost before she could name it, but Mira recognized it anyway, because she had seen that same flicker in the faces of difficult patient's family members who did not appreciate being contradicted. Roland recovered quickly, offering a short laugh and a dismissive comment about admiring her loyalty, before excusing himself and walking away down the corridor. Draven emerged from the chamber a few minutes later, his expression tight with the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent an hour defending himself against accusations delivered by people who would never have to prove their own competence the way he was constantly forced to prove his. Mira took his hand without a word, and together they walked back toward the estate in silence, the weight of the council's scrutiny trailing behind them like a shadow. That night, unable to sleep, Mira decided to visit the estate's small library again, hoping a second, more careful search through the old records might reveal something she had missed during her first visit weeks earlier. She moved quietly through the darkened corridors, a single candle lighting her path, and slipped into the library without waking anyone. She located the volume covering the year of Draven's accident once more, and this time examined not just the entry itself, but the surrounding pages, searching for any cross-reference, any mention in adjacent records that might have escaped her attention before. It was in a separate ledger, tucked several shelves away, recording pack expenditures rather than incidents, that she finally found something useful. A payment, recorded roughly 2 weeks after the date of Draven's accident, listed simply as compensation, healing services, B. Ferris, followed by an amount considerably larger than any other healer's payment recorded elsewhere in the same ledger. Mira stared at the entry for a long moment, her pulse quickening. A payment large enough to raise questions, made to the very healer who had vanished from the pack within the year, recorded under a vague label that told her nothing about what the payment had actually purchased. She copied the entry carefully into her private notebook, along with the exact page and ledger reference, and returned both books to their shelves before making her way back to her room, her mind racing with implications she was not yet ready to fully accept. The following days brought a strange, tense calm to the estate. The council's scrutiny easing slightly after Draven's report seemed to satisfy at least the more reasonable members, though Mira noticed Roland's faction remained quietly dissatisfied, their whispered conversations trailing off whenever she or Draven approached. She continued her careful investigation in small, cautious steps, learning more sign language from Corin during the day and returning to the library alone at night, piecing together a picture that grew more troubling with every new detail she uncovered. One evening, while practicing signs with Draven in the study, she worked up the courage to ask him directly about the accident, choosing her words carefully, watching his face for any sign of the discomfort she had come to recognize. "What actually happened that night?" she signed slowly. "The night you lost your hearing." Draven's expression shifted, something guarded settling over his features, and for a long moment he did not answer at all, his eyes fixed on some point past her shoulder, as though seeing the memory replay itself. Finally his hands moved, slow and deliberate. "I do not remember all of it. I remember pain, and then waking up days later with silence, where sound used to be. The healers said I was struck during a skirmish. I have no reason to doubt them." Mira studied him carefully, noting the slight hesitation before he signed the final sentence. The way his eyes did not quite meet hers as he said it. "I have no reason to doubt them" did not sound like a statement of certainty. It sounded like a man repeating an explanation he had been given, rather than one he had actually witnessed himself. She did not push further that night, sensing that the topic touched something raw and unresolved in him, something that would require patience and trust to fully uncover. But as she lay awake later, staring at the ceiling, she found herself more convinced than ever that the official story of Draven's accident was incomplete, and that somewhere beneath the careful, hasty treatment and the quiet compensation paid to a healer who later vanished, the true answer waited, patient and dangerous, for someone determined enough to find it. The next morning, Mira decided to approach the problem from a different angle. If Bellamy Ferris had left the pack for a distant territory, perhaps someone still in contact with him could tell her more than the old records ever could. She thought immediately of Talia, who had mentioned him with the familiarity of someone who had at least crossed paths with him professionally, even if only briefly before his departure. She found Talia in the healer's workroom, grinding herbs with practiced hands, and asked, as casually as she could manage, whether the healer had left any forwarding information when he departed the pack. Talia's hands slowed, though she did not look up immediately, and when she finally answered, her voice carried a careful weight that told Mira she had chosen her words with deliberate caution. "I do not know exactly where he went," Talia said, "but I know he did not leave willingly. There was talk, quiet talk, that he was encouraged to go, given a generous sum and a clear suggestion that his continued presence in the pack was no longer welcome. I never learned why. I was new here myself, and such matters were not shared with someone still earning trust." Mira absorbed this new piece carefully, fitting it against the payment she had found in the ledger, against the vague official record of the accident, against the pattern that was slowly forming in her mind like a photograph developing in a darkroom. A healer paid generously, then quietly pushed out of the pack entirely, his departure wrapped in silence just as thorough as the silence surrounding the accident itself. She thanked Talia, and left the workroom with her thoughts churning, aware that each new detail she uncovered only deepened the mystery, rather than resolving it. Whoever had orchestrated whatever truly happened to Draven 3 years ago had been careful, thorough, patient enough to smooth over every loose thread with money and quiet pressure, rather than leaving anything obvious enough to draw suspicion. That evening, she added the new details to her hidden notebook, her handwriting small and careful beneath the loose floorboard, and found herself staring at the growing list of names and dates with a mixture of determination and unease. Bellamy Ferris, the vague ledger entry, the reassigned guards. Roland's constant, careful presence. Each detail alone meant little. Together, they formed the unmistakable shape of a conspiracy that had been protecting itself successfully for 3 long years, and Mira intended to be the one who finally brought it into the light, no matter what it cost her to do so. A few days later, a formal dinner was arranged to celebrate 1 month of the marriage, a milestone the council had insisted upon publicly acknowledging, since the original wager required the union to remain intact for the full 30 days, before Draven's position could be considered secure. Mira dressed carefully that evening, aware that every eye in the hall would be studying her, searching for cracks in a marriage that had, against expectation, grown into something far more genuine than either of them had anticipated. The hall was filled with warm light and the low hum of conversation when they arrived, Draven's hand resting steady at the small of her back as they moved through the crowd, pausing occasionally so Corin could translate brief exchanges with pack members, eager to offer congratulations. Mira noticed, with quiet satisfaction, that more faces greeted her with genuine warmth than had a month earlier, the pack slowly beginning to accept her not merely as an outsider bought into the family, but as someone who had earned a measure of respect through her own conduct. Roland, predictably, found a moment to approach them during the evening, raising a glass in a toast that sounded gracious on the surface, but carried an unmistakable edge beneath it. "To 1 month of marriage," he said, his eyes moving between them. "Longer than some expected, though the 30 days are not quite finished yet. Plenty of time still for surprises." Draven, reading the toast through Corin's quick translation, simply nodded once, refusing to give his cousin the reaction he was clearly hoping to provoke. Mira raised her own glass calmly, meeting Roland's gaze without flinching, and said only that surprises tended to work both directions, a comment that made Roland's smile falter slightly, before he moved on to another conversation. Later in the evening, While Draven was occupied speaking with several senior pack elders, Mira slipped away from the main hall, drawn by a flash of familiar movement near a side corridor. She followed at a discreet distance, and found Corin standing near a servant's entrance, speaking quietly with a man she did not recognize, someone dressed plainly, clearly not a member of the estate's regular staff. She could not make out their words from where she stood, but something about the tension in Corin's posture, the quick, furtive way the stranger glanced around before slipping out through the servant's entrance, struck her as deeply out of place. Corin, meanwhile, straightened his jacket and returned toward the main hall with his usual composed expression, as though nothing unusual had occurred at all. Mira waited a moment before following, her mind spinning with new questions. Corin, who translated every private word between herself and Draven, who stood close enough to overhear nearly everything that passed through the estate's most guarded conversations, meeting secretly with an unfamiliar man during a formal gathering meant to celebrate the marriage he claimed to fully support. She did not know yet whether Corin's loyalty belonged entirely to Draven or whether it had been quietly compromised somewhere along the way, but the sight unsettled her deeply, adding yet another uncertain thread to the growing tangle she was slowly, carefully working to unravel. As she returned to the main hall and took her place once more beside her husband, smiling for the benefit of the watching crowd, she found herself wondering, for the first time, whether the danger circling this pack might be standing far closer to Draven than either of them had ever suspected. Mira did not sleep at all the night after the dinner, replaying the image of Corin speaking quietly with the unfamiliar stranger near the servant's entrance, turning the moment over and over until it lost all shape and simply became a knot of unease sitting heavy in her chest. By morning, she had decided on a course of action, though it frightened her more than anything she had attempted since arriving at the estate. She would watch Corin carefully, without confronting him directly, without letting him suspect that she had seen anything at all. If his loyalty to Draven remained genuine, her caution would cost nothing. If it did not, she needed to know exactly how deep the betrayal ran before bringing her suspicions to her husband, who trusted Corin more completely than almost anyone else in his life. The opportunity to observe more closely came sooner than she expected. 2 days after the dinner, Draven left the estate for a full day to inspect a dispute between two farming families near the eastern boundary, taking a small escort of guards with him but leaving Corin behind, since the dispute itself required no translation, and Draven preferred to handle minor local matters personally, using written notes with the farmers, rather than requiring his translator's full attention. With Draven gone for the day, Mira found herself with an unusual amount of freedom to move through the estate without immediately drawing attention. She spent the morning with Talia as usual, then excused herself in the early afternoon, claiming a headache that required rest, and instead positioned herself near a window overlooking the estate's eastern courtyard, where she had a clear view of the servants' entrance Corin had used 2 nights earlier. She waited for nearly 2 hours before her patience was rewarded. Corin emerged from a side door, glancing around with the same careful, furtive movement she remembered from the dinner, before making his way toward the tree line beyond the courtyard wall. Mira's pulse quickened. She grabbed a light shawl and slipped out through a different exit, following at a distance she hoped was safe enough to remain unnoticed, while still keeping him in sight. The forest beyond the estate walls was quiet, sunlight filtering through the canopy in scattered patches, and Mira moved as carefully as she could, grateful for the soft ground that muffled her footsteps. She followed Corin for nearly 10 minutes before he stopped in a small clearing, where the same unfamiliar man from the dinner was already waiting, leaning against a tree with the casual patience of someone accustomed to secrecy. Mira crouched behind a thick cluster of bushes, close enough to watch, but far enough, she hoped, to remain hidden. She could not hear their conversation clearly, only fragments carried on the wind, but she caught enough to feel her stomach drop. The stranger mentioned a name, Roland, spoken with familiarity rather than surprise, and Corin's response, though inaudible, carried an anxious, pleading quality in the way his hands moved and his shoulders hunched forward. After several minutes, the stranger handed Corin a small folded paper, which Corin tucked quickly into his jacket, before turning to leave the clearing. Mira pressed herself further into the bushes as he passed nearby, her heart pounding so loudly she feared he might somehow hear it despite the distance between them, but he continued past without noticing, his expression troubled, his pace hurried. She waited until both men had fully disappeared before emerging from her hiding place, her mind racing through the implications of what she had just witnessed. Corin, meeting secretly with someone connected to Roland, receiving something passed between them in careful secrecy. It did not necessarily prove betrayal, she reminded herself, forcing calm into her racing thoughts. There could be explanations she had not yet considered, but the evidence was mounting in a direction she desperately did not want to believe. She returned to the estate quietly, her headache excuse still holding, and spent the rest of the afternoon in her room, staring at the wall, trying to decide what to do with what she had seen. Confronting Corin directly seemed foolish, likely to alert him and whoever he was working with that his secret meetings had been discovered. Telling Draven immediately, without more concrete evidence, risked destroying a friendship and working relationship that had clearly meant a great deal to him for years, based on nothing more than a witnessed meeting she could not fully interpret. She decided, reluctantly, to wait, to gather more before acting, though the decision sat uneasily in her stomach for the rest of the day. Draven returned from the eastern boundary that evening, tired but satisfied that the farming dispute had been settled fairly, and Mira greeted him with a warmth that she hoped concealed the turmoil churning beneath her calm exterior. They ate dinner together quietly, Corin present as usual to translate, and Mira found herself studying her husband's translator with new eyes throughout the meal, searching his familiar, composed expression for any hint of the anxiety she had witnessed in the forest clearing hours earlier. Corin gave nothing away. His hands moved with their usual steady precision, his expression remained calm and professional, and if Mira had not seen him with her own eyes meeting secretly in the woods, she would never have suspected anything was amiss at all. The realization unsettled her more than anything else that day. If Corin could hide this so completely, how many other secrets was he capable of concealing, and for how long had he already been doing so? That night, after Draven had fallen asleep, Mira slipped down to her room and added the day's events to her hidden notebook, her handwriting tight and controlled despite the anxiety still coursing through her. Corin, secret meeting, mentioned Roland by name, received a folded paper. She stared at the entry for a long time, before closing the notebook and returning it to its hiding place beneath the floorboard, feeling, for the first time since her investigation began, genuinely frightened of what she might eventually uncover. The following morning brought an unexpected development that pushed her concerns about Corin momentarily to the side. A messenger arrived from the city, bearing an urgent letter for Mira concerning her mother, who had been readmitted to the hospital after a sudden decline in her condition. Mira's hands shook as she read the letter, the careful investigation she had been conducting suddenly feeling distant and unimportant compared to the fear now gripping her chest. She found Draven in the study and showed him the letter, her composure cracking for the first time since arriving at the estate. He read it quickly, his expression softening with immediate concern, and without hesitation, signed that she should go to the city right away, that arrangements would be made for her travel that very morning, and that he would send additional funds to ensure her mother received the best possible care. Mira thanked him, grateful beyond words for his immediate support, though a small, cautious part of her mind noted that this sudden crisis would leave the estate and her ongoing investigation unattended for however long her mother's condition required her presence in the city. She pushed the thought aside as unworthy of the moment and focused instead on preparing to leave. Draven arranged for Callan, the friendly young guard who had walked with her to the northern boundary weeks earlier, to accompany her to the city as protection, along with a driver familiar with the roads. Before she left, Draven took her hands in the study, his expression heavy with worry he could not fully express through signs alone, and simply held her for a long moment, his forehead resting against hers, before stepping back and letting her go. The drive to the city took most of the morning, and Mira spent the time staring out the window, watching the packed territory give way gradually to familiar city streets, her mind torn between worry for her mother and the unfinished threads of investigation she had left behind at the estate. She thought of Corin's secret meeting, of the folded paper passed between him and the stranger, of Roland's name spoken with such casual familiarity, and wondered whether leaving now, even for something as urgent as her mother's health, might allow whatever conspiracy was unfolding to advance further while she was away and unable to watch. The hospital was exactly as she remembered it, busy and overcrowded, the same corridors she had walked countless times during her years working there now feeling strange and distant after weeks spent in the quiet, guarded world of packed territory. She found her mother's room quickly, her heart aching at the sight of the older woman looking smaller and more fragile than Mira remembered, hooked to monitors that beeped steadily in a rhythm Mira had once found comforting but now found unbearably tense. Her mother's eyes opened weakly as Mira approached, and a faint, tired smile crossed her face. "You came," she whispered. Mira took her hand gently, assuring her that of course she had come, that nothing could have kept her away, and spent the next several hours simply sitting beside the bed, listening to updates from the doctors, who explained that her mother's condition, while serious, was stable for now, and responding cautiously well to treatment. Callan waited patiently in the hospital's waiting area throughout the day, occasionally checking in to see if Mira needed anything, his presence a quiet, steady comfort in an otherwise overwhelming day. By evening, the doctors confirmed that her mother's condition had stabilized enough that immediate danger had passed, though a longer recovery period would still be required, and Mira allowed herself a small measure of relief for the first time since receiving the letter that morning. She stayed at her mother's bedside until visiting hours ended, promising to return the following day, and left the hospital with Callan as the city settled into evening. As they walked toward the car, Mira noticed a familiar figure across the street, someone who looked remarkably like the stranger from the forest clearing, standing near a small cafe, watching the hospital entrance with an attentiveness that seemed far too focused to be casual. She grabbed Callan's arm and pointed subtly, asking if he recognized the man, but by the time Callan turned to look, the figure had already disappeared into the evening crowd, leaving Mira uncertain whether she had truly seen him, or whether exhaustion and worry had conjured a familiar face where none actually existed. Still, the sighting unsettled her deeply, adding a new, frightening dimension to her suspicions. If Roland's associates were watching the hospital, watching her mother, the danger she had been carefully investigating from a distance had suddenly moved far closer to the people she loved most. That night, in a small hotel room near the hospital, Mira wrote everything down in her notebook, hands trembling slightly, as she recorded the possible sighting alongside her other careful observations. She did not know for certain that the man had been watching her, did not know for certain that Roland's reach extended all the way into the city, but she could no longer afford to dismiss the possibility, and the fear that had been a quiet undercurrent throughout her investigation suddenly felt sharp and immediate, in a way it never had within the relative safety of the estate walls. She called Draven that night, using a video relay service the hospital staff helped her arrange, wanting to see his face and sign to him directly, rather than send only a written message. When his face appeared on the small screen, worry etched clearly across his features. She felt a wave of relief, so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. She told him about her mother's stabilized condition first, watching his shoulders ease slightly with the news, and then, choosing her words carefully, mentioned the figure she thought she had seen outside the hospital. Draven's expression sharpened immediately, his hands moving quickly across the screen. "Describe him again." Mira did her best, recalling the man's build, his plain clothing, the careful way he had positioned himself to watch the entrance without appearing to watch it at all. Draven's jaw tightened as he listened, and he promised to send additional guards to the city immediately, insisting that Callan remain with her at all times until she returned to the estate. Mira thanked him, grateful for his immediate concern, and the two of them stayed connected a while longer, Draven asking gentle questions about her mother's condition, Mira asking about the estate in her absence, both of them clearly reluctant to end the call despite the late hour. Before disconnecting, Draven signed something simple but heartfelt. "Be careful. Come home soon." Mira signed back a promise to do exactly that, and closed the call feeling both comforted and more anxious than ever, aware that whatever danger she had stumbled into was no longer confined to the quiet corridors of the Pack estate. 2 additional guards arrived from Pack territory early the next morning, stationing themselves discreetly near the hospital entrance and the small hotel where Mira was staying, and though their presence did little to fully calm her nerves, it offered a measure of practical reassurance as she resumed her daily visits to her mother's bedside. Over the following 2 days, her mother's condition continued to improve steadily, color returning to her face, strength slowly returning to her voice, until the doctors finally confirmed she was stable enough to be discharged with a careful recovery plan and regular follow-up appointments. Relieved beyond words, Mira arranged for her mother to stay with a trusted neighbor who had long ago become like family, someone who promised to look after her closely during the coming weeks of recovery. With her mother settled and safe, and with the added security of guards watching over the arrangement, Mira finally allowed herself to prepare for the return journey to Pact territory, her mind already turning back toward Corin, toward Roland, toward the tangled web of secrets she had left unfinished at the estate, now more determined than ever to see the investigation through to its end. The drive back to Pact territory felt longer than the journey to the city had, every mile bringing Mira closer to unresolved questions she had carried with her the entire time she sat beside her mother's hospital bed. Callan drove in comfortable silence beside her, sensing her need for quiet, and Mira spent the hours turning over everything she had witnessed and everything she still needed to uncover, her resolve hardening with every passing mile. Draven met her at the estate entrance the moment the car arrived, pulling her into an embrace before she had even fully stepped out of the vehicle, his relief at her safe return evident in the way he held her a beat longer than any greeting required. She melted into him for a moment, allowing herself the comfort of his presence after days of tension and worry, before pulling back enough to sign that she needed to speak with him privately, away from the ears and eyes of the estate. They retreated to his private study, the one room in the estate where Draven kept the fewest staff nearby, and Mira closed the door firmly behind them, before retrieving her hidden notebook, which she had carried carefully wrapped inside her luggage throughout the entire trip. She laid it open on his desk and began walking him through everything, page by page, detail by detail, using a combination of careful signs and written notes to ensure nothing was lost in translation. She told him about the sparse accident record in the library, about Bellamy Ferris, and the strange, generous payment made to him before his sudden departure, about the reassigned guards near the northern boundary, and finally, with the greatest hesitation, she told him about Corin, about the secret meeting in the forest clearing, about the stranger's name for Roland spoken with such easy familiarity, about the folded paper passed quietly between them. Draven read each entry with growing tension visible in his shoulders, his expression darkening steadily as the picture Mira had assembled came into full view before him. When she finished, he sat back in his chair, one hand pressed against his temple, processing everything in silence for a long moment before finally signing a response. "I trusted him completely," he said, referring to Corin, his hands moving slower than usual, weighted with something close to grief. "He has been at my side since before the accident. If he has betrayed that trust, I do not know what else in my life I can still believe is real." Mira reached across the desk and took his hand firmly, signing back with as much conviction as she could manage. "We do not know everything yet, but we know enough to be careful. We need proof before we accuse him of anything, proof strong enough that even the council cannot dismiss it." Draven nodded slowly, agreeing, though the pain in his expression remained. They spent the next hour discussing careful next steps, deciding together that confronting Corin directly remained too risky until they understood the full scope of what he might be involved in, and that continuing to watch quietly, gathering evidence, was the wiser path forward, despite how difficult it would be to maintain a normal working relationship with him in the meantime. As their conversation wound down, Mira noticed Draven wincing again, pressing his palm against the side of his head near his ear, in the same familiar gesture she had observed countless times since her arrival. This time, watching him closely after days away, she noticed something she had missed before. A faint discoloration just beneath the old scar tissue, subtle, but visible now that she was looking for it, with a trained, careful eye. "Does it hurt worse than usual tonight?" she signed, concern sharpening her attention. Draven hesitated before answering honestly. "It has been worse the past 2 days. I did not want to worry you further while you were dealing with your mother." Mira's nursing instincts overrode her exhaustion instantly. "Let me look at it properly," she signed, moving around the desk to stand beside him. Draven hesitated only a moment before nodding, tilting his head slightly to give her better access to the old injury site. She examined the scar carefully under the study's warm lamplight, her fingers gentle but thorough as she pressed lightly around the discolored skin, watching his face for any flicker of pain that might guide her assessment. The scar tissue felt unusually firm in one small area, slightly raised, with a texture that did not match healed injury the way she would have expected after 3 years. She pressed there again, more carefully, and Draven's breath caught sharply, his hand rising instinctively before he forced it back down, allowing her to continue. "That is not normal scar tissue," she said aloud, mostly to herself, though she signed the observation to Draven as well. There is something firm beneath the skin here, something that does not feel like healed tissue at all. Draven's eyes widened slightly, uncertainty flickering across his face. What do you mean? Mira retrieved a small penlight from her travel bag, one of the few items from her nursing kit she had brought along out of habit, and examined the area more closely, angling the light carefully against the scar. Beneath the thin, slightly raised skin, she could just make out the faintest outline of something rigid and unnatural, something that most certainly did not belong beneath a person's skin. Her pulse quickened as understanding began to dawn, a suspicion so strange and unexpected that she almost doubted her own trained eyes. I think, she said slowly, choosing her words with careful precision, there is something inside this wound that was never meant to heal the way an ordinary injury heals. I think something was placed here, deliberately, and left beneath the skin. Draven stared at her, his expression caught between confusion and dawning alarm, and Mira felt the full weight of the moment settle over both of them. Whatever she had just discovered, whatever strange object had been hidden beneath his skin for 3 long years, it was about to change everything they thought they understood about the night he lost his hearing. Draven's hands trembled slightly as he signed his next question. Can you remove it? Mira hesitated, weighing the request carefully against everything her training had taught her about proper medical procedure. Normally, she would never consider something like this outside a sterile clinical setting, but she also understood, with sudden clarity, that whatever was hidden beneath his skin represented evidence of something far more significant than an ordinary medical concern, evidence that might disappear or be tampered with if word of its discovery reached the wrong ears before they had a chance to examine it properly. I need proper tools first, she signed carefully. And I want Talia present. She has experience with this kind of procedure that I do not have in this setting, and I trust her. Draven agreed immediately, and within the hour, Talia had been quietly summoned to the private study, her expression shifting from mild confusion to sharp focus the moment Mira explained what she had discovered beneath the old scar tissue. Talia examined the area herself, her experienced fingers confirming everything Mira had already found, and after a long moment of careful consideration, she nodded slowly. I have seen something like this once before, many years ago, in a completely different context, she admitted quietly. A tracking device, small enough to implant beneath skin, used by certain factions during territorial conflicts to monitor rivals without their knowledge. I never imagined I would see one here, in this pack, beneath the skin of our own Alpha. The word tracking device sent a cold shock through Mira's chest, the pieces of her investigation suddenly rearranging themselves into a far more sinister shape than she had anticipated. Not merely a keepsake of a violent accident, but a deliberate implant, placed the very night Draven lost his hearing, hidden carefully enough that no healer since had noticed it. Or perhaps, she thought with growing unease, no healer since had been permitted the opportunity to look closely enough to find it. Talia gathered proper sterile tools from the healer's workroom, while Mira prepared the space in the study as best she could, laying out clean cloths and disinfectant, her hands steady despite the racing pulse beneath her calm exterior. Draven sat still, his jaw tight with a mixture of apprehension and grim determination, clearly bracing himself for whatever they were about to uncover. When Talia returned, the two women worked together with careful, practiced coordination, Mira numbing the area gently, while Talia prepared a small, precise instrument for the delicate extraction ahead. Draven gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles pale, as Mira made a small, careful incision along the edge of the firm raised tissue, working slowly, patiently, mindful of how close the area sat to sensitive structures near his ear. The procedure took nearly 20 minutes, each moment stretching taut with tension, until finally, with careful, steady pressure, Mira extracted a small object no larger than a grain of rice, metallic and unmistakably manufactured. Nothing natural about its shape or texture at all. She held it up to the lamplight, turning it slowly, her breath catching at the sight of tiny, precise engravings along one edge, markings that clearly indicated deliberate craftsmanship rather than any kind of natural occurrence. Talia leaned close, examining the object with wide eyes. That is no accident, she said quietly. That is exactly what I feared. A listening device, small enough to remain hidden, sturdy enough to survive years beneath the skin, transmitting whatever it can pick up to someone who has been listening this entire time. Draven stared at the tiny object cradled in Mira's palm, his expression shifting through shock, anger, and finally a cold, focused clarity that Mira had not seen in him before. He signed slowly, each word deliberate and heavy with new understanding. Someone has been listening to everything I have said in private for 3 years. Every strategy discussion, every private conversation, every weakness I ever admitted to trusted advisors. Mira closed her fingers gently around the tiny device, feeling its cold weight settle into her palm, like the answer to a question she had been chasing for weeks, without fully realizing how dark the truth would turn out to be. Whoever placed this, she signed carefully, was never trying to injure you by accident. They were trying to control you, quietly, patiently, for years, without you ever knowing. The three of them sat in heavy silence, the small device resting on the desk between them, evidence of a betrayal so deliberate and so long sustained that none of them could yet fully grasp its full implications. But one thing had become unmistakably clear in that single quiet moment. The story of Draven's accident, that the entire pack had believed for 3 years, was not merely incomplete. It was a carefully constructed lie, and somewhere within the pack, the person responsible for planting it was still walking free, still watching, still listening, unaware that their secret had finally been found. Talia carefully dressed the small wound left by the extraction, assuring Draven that it would heal cleanly within days, far more cleanly than the original injury ever had, given proper care rather than whatever hurried, questionable treatment had been applied 3 years earlier. As she worked, she spoke quietly of the responsibility now resting on all three of them, to keep this discovery absolutely secret until they understood exactly who was responsible and how deeply the betrayal reached into the pack's leadership. "We cannot act rashly," Talia warned, glancing between Mira and Draven with the seriousness of someone who understood exactly how dangerous the coming days might become. "Whoever placed this device will notice quickly if it stops transmitting. We need to think carefully about what happens next, because the moment they realize it has been found, they will either flee or move against us directly, and we need to be prepared for either outcome." Draven nodded slowly, his expression hardening with resolve even as exhaustion pulled at the edges of his composure. He signed carefully, his hands steady despite everything. "We need to find out who built this device, and who has been receiving its signal." Ferris left the pack quietly with a large payment. Perhaps he did not act alone, and perhaps he did not act willingly either. Mira, still holding the tiny device wrapped carefully in a clean cloth, felt a fresh wave of determination steady her nerves. "I know someone who might help us trace it," she signed slowly, thinking of a former colleague from the hospital who had once mentioned working alongside investigators skilled in identifying unusual manufactured components. "It will take discretion, and it will take time, but I believe we can find out exactly what this is and where it came from." The three of them agreed, in the quiet hours before dawn finally broke over the estate, that the investigation would continue in absolute secrecy, shared only among themselves, until they possessed enough proof to act decisively, rather than merely raise suspicion. Corin's involvement remained an open, painful question, one Draven still could not bring himself to fully accept despite the mounting evidence, and Roland's shadow stretched over every piece of the puzzle they had assembled so far, though proving his direct involvement in planting the device itself remained, for now, frustratingly out of reach. As the first light of morning touched the study windows, Draven reached for Mira's hand, holding it firmly, gratitude and something deeper shining plainly in his tired eyes. Whatever came next, whatever danger the coming days might bring, he no longer faced it as a man alone, uncertain of who around him could truly be trusted. He faced it with a partner at his side who had proven, in the span of a single quiet examination, that she was willing to fight for him with the same fierce determination she brought to every patient she had ever cared for. And that fact alone gave him more strength than he had felt in 3 long, silent years. 2 days after the extraction, Mira contacted her former hospital colleague, a sharp, careful woman named Priya, who had once worked briefly alongside a private investigations firm before returning to nursing, and who Mira trusted completely with sensitive information after years of working difficult cases together. She traveled to the city under the guise of checking on her recovering mother, Callan accompanying her once again, and met Priya in a quiet corner of a small cafe far from the hospital where anyone from Pack territory might recognize them. Priya examined the tiny device carefully, under a small magnifying loupe she carried in her bag, turning it slowly, studying the faint engravings along its edge, with the same careful attention Mira remembered from years of watching her assess complicated wounds. After several minutes of silent examination, Priya set the device down on the cafe table and looked up with an expression Mira recognized instantly as genuine concern. "This is specialized equipment," Priya said quietly, keeping her voice low despite the cafe's ambient noise. "Not something built by an amateur working alone. The craftsmanship suggests a manufacturer who deals in surveillance technology for serious clients, people willing to pay significant sums for devices designed to remain hidden and functional for years. I know someone who might be able to trace the manufacturer's mark, if you are willing to leave it with me for a few days." Mira hesitated, reluctant to part with the only physical evidence they possessed, but ultimately trusted Priya enough to agree, understanding that proper tracing required expertise and equipment she simply did not have access to within Pack territory. She left the device carefully wrapped and labeled, along with detailed notes about where and how it had been found, and returned to the estate that evening carrying both hope and renewed anxiety in equal measure. While waiting for Priya's findings, Mira and Draven turned their attention back to the matter of Corin, whose behavior in the days since her return had grown increasingly strained, his usual calm composure occasionally slipping into moments of visible distraction that neither of them could ignore. Draven, unable to bring himself to confront his longtime friend directly without proof, instead asked Talia to quietly observe Corin's movements whenever possible, hoping to gather additional information without alerting him to their growing suspicion. Talia's observations over the following days painted an increasingly troubling picture. Corin had been seen leaving the estate grounds alone on several occasions, always during hours when Draven's schedule kept him occupied elsewhere, always returning within an hour or two with the same anxious, guarded expression Mira had witnessed in the forest clearing weeks earlier. On one occasion, Talia reported seeing him receive a small package from a courier at the estate's outer gate, a package he quickly concealed beneath his coat, before hurrying inside. The mounting evidence weighed heavily on Draven, who spent his evenings in troubled silence, staring at old photographs from years earlier showing himself and Corin as younger men, long before the accident, long before any of this careful, painful investigation had become necessary. Mira sat with him during these quiet moments, offering comfort without pushing him to speak before he was ready, understanding from her years in nursing that grief, even grief for a friendship that might not yet be fully lost, needed space to breathe before it could be properly addressed. Priya's message arrived 6 days later, delivered discreetly through a trusted courier rather than anything that could be intercepted or traced back to its source. Mira read the letter alone in her room, her hands tightening around the paper as she absorbed its contents. The device's manufacturing mark traced back to a small, specialized firm operating out of a neighboring territory, a firm known within certain circles for producing custom surveillance equipment for clients who valued absolute discretion above all else. Priya had managed to obtain, through careful and cautious inquiry, a partial record of the firm's recent transactions, and one name appeared among the client list that made Mira's breath catch entirely. Roland Ashworth. She stared at the name for a long moment, feeling the final, damning piece settle into place, transforming weeks of careful suspicion into undeniable, concrete proof. Roland had not simply positioned himself conveniently near every crisis. He had orchestrated the crisis itself 3 years earlier, planting a device beneath his own cousin's skin during whatever true circumstances had actually caused his hearing loss, monitoring his private conversations ever since, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to seize the throne that had never truly been within his reach, while Draven remained sharp, competent, and trusted by those closest to him. Mira brought the letter immediately to Draven, watching his face carefully as he read the name, watching decades of complicated family history and betrayal crash together behind his eyes. He sat very still for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before finally signing a single, heavy question. "Do you think Corin knew?" Mira did not have a comforting answer to offer. "I do not know for certain," she signed honestly. "But given what we have both witnessed, I think it is very likely that Corin has been working with Roland in some capacity, whether willingly or under some kind of pressure we do not yet understand." Draven closed his eyes, absorbing the weight of the moment, and when he opened them again, something had shifted in his expression, grief giving way slowly to a hardened, focused resolve. "We need proof strong enough to bring before the full council," he signed. "Not whispers, not suspicion, but something undeniable enough that even Roland's allies cannot dismiss it." Mira nodded, already turning her mind toward the next careful steps required to build an airtight case, but even as she began planning, a cold unease settled over her. If Roland had been sophisticated enough to plant a hidden listening device and maintain the secret for 3 full years, he would not surrender his ambitions easily once he realized his carefully constructed deception had finally been discovered. Whatever came next, she understood with growing certainty, would require more than proof alone. It would require careful preparation for a confrontation that Roland would not walk away from without a fight. Over the following days, Mira and Draven worked quietly with Talia to strengthen their case, gathering the ledger entry recording the strange payment to Bellamy Ferris, Priya's letter detailing the device's manufacturing origin, and Talia's careful notes documenting Corin's suspicious movements over the past 2 weeks. Mira also reached out once more to Priya, asking whether Bellamy Ferris himself might be located and persuaded to speak about what had truly happened the night of Draven's accident, since a first-hand account from the healer who had treated him would carry far more weight before the council than physical evidence alone. Priya's search took several more days, but eventually, she located a healer matching Ferris's description, now working quietly in a small coastal territory far from Packlands, living under circumstances that suggested a man who had spent 3 years trying to disappear from his old life entirely. Priya arranged a cautious, indirect introduction through a mutual contact, and Mira composed a careful letter explaining who she was and what she and Draven had discovered, hoping the appeal to conscience might succeed where confrontation would surely fail. The reply came back slower than Mira would have liked, nearly a week later, but when it finally arrived, it confirmed everything they had feared and more. Ferris wrote with the halting, guilty honesty of a man who had carried a heavy secret for far too long. He explained that on the night of the supposed border skirmish, he had been summoned urgently to treat Draven, not for injuries sustained in battle, but for a wound inflicted deliberately, under circumstances he had been paid, and later threatened, into never revealing. He had been told simply that the true story could never come out, that the safety of his own family depended on his silence, and that a generous payment awaited his cooperation, followed swiftly by pressure to leave the pack entirely once his usefulness had ended. He did not name Roland directly in the letter, clearly still cautious even from a distance, but he described enough details: the location of the injury, the presence of a cousin who had been unusually calm and controlled throughout the crisis, rather than appropriately alarmed, for Draven to feel the last remaining doubt drain from his body entirely. It was Roland. It had always been Roland, orchestrating an injury designed to look like the cost of leadership rather than the result of deliberate betrayal, ensuring his cousin would be underestimated and monitored for as long as it took to finish what he had started 3 years earlier. Draven read the letter twice, his hands trembling slightly by the second reading, and when he finally set it down, Mira watched something settle over him that looked less like grief now and more like quiet, focused determination. "We have enough," he signed slowly. "Enough to bring before the council. Enough to finally end this." Mira agreed, though the relief of finally possessing undeniable proof was tempered by a growing awareness of just how dangerous the coming confrontation would be. Roland had spent 3 years building a careful, patient deception, and men who invested that much time and effort into a lie rarely surrendered gracefully once it finally unraveled before them. That evening, Draven made the difficult decision to speak with Corin directly, choosing honesty over continued surveillance, reasoning that if their long friendship still held any value at all, Corin deserved the chance to explain himself before being formally accused. Mira worried about the risk, cautioning that alerting Corin might give him time to warn Roland before they were ready to act. But Draven remained firm, insisting he owed his oldest friend at least this much before moving forward with any public accusation. He summoned Corin to the private study late that night, Mira standing quietly nearby, and laid the evidence out on the desk between them, without preamble: the ledger entry, Priya's letter, and finally Ferris's careful, guilty confession. Corin's face drained of color as he read through each document, his hands trembling as he set the pages down, and for a long moment, The study was heavy, with a silence that felt far louder than any sound Draven had lost the ability to hear. Finally, Corrin's hands moved, slow and unsteady, his confession spilling out with the particular relief of a man who had carried a secret far too heavy for far too long. He admitted that Roland had approached him shortly after the accident, not with threats at first, but with careful, persuasive arguments about protecting the pack from instability, convincing Corrin that quiet, controlled oversight of Draven's private conversations served the greater good during a fragile transition period. Only gradually had Corrin come to understand the true depth of Roland's ambition, and by then, threats against his own family had ensured his continued, reluctant cooperation. "I never wanted to hurt you," Corrin signed, his hands shaking badly enough that some of his signs came out imprecise, tears visible in his eyes for the first time since Mira had known him. "I told myself I was protecting the pack. I told myself it was temporary. I am so sorry." Draven sat in heavy silence for a long moment, grief and anger warring visibly across his face, before finally signing a measured response. "I believe you did not intend the harm you caused, but intention does not undo 3 years of betrayal. You will help us finish this, and then we will decide together what comes next for you." Corrin nodded quickly, desperate relief flooding his expression at the possibility of redemption rather than immediate, total condemnation, and agreed to provide whatever additional information he possessed about Roland's plans, including the location of records and communications that could serve as further proof before the council. With Corrin's reluctant but genuine cooperation secured, Mira felt the final pieces of their case fall into place, and as the night wore on, the three of them began carefully planning exactly how and when to bring the truth before the full council, knowing that once the confrontation began, there would be no path left for turning back. With Corrin's cooperation secured, the plan to expose Roland began taking careful shape over the following days, every detail examined and re-examined for weaknesses that might allow him to slip free of the consequences he had spent 3 years avoiding. Corrin provided crucial information about a hidden ledger Roland kept in a locked drawer within his private quarters, recording payments made to the surveillance firm, along with correspondence that detailed his long-term plans for consolidating power once Draven had been sufficiently discredited. Retrieving that ledger without alerting Roland became the central challenge facing them, since his quarters remained heavily guarded by loyal staff members who reported directly to him, and any suspicious activity near his private wing would almost certainly reach his ears within hours. Draven, Mira, Talia, and Corrin spent 2 full days debating various approaches before finally settling on a plan that relied on Corrin's continued access to Roland's trust, an access none of them felt entirely comfortable exploiting, but which offered the clearest path toward the proof they needed. Corrin would request a private meeting with Roland, under the guise of reporting on Draven's supposed plans for the upcoming council session, a meeting Roland would almost certainly agree to given his ongoing reliance on Corrin as his primary source of inside information. While Roland was occupied with that meeting, Talia, who had legitimate reason to move freely through most areas of the estate in her role as healer, would create a distraction near his private quarters, allowing Mira, who Roland would never suspect of anything so bold, to slip inside and locate the hidden ledger. The plan carried obvious risks, and Mira felt her pulse racing steadily as the appointed evening finally arrived. She dressed plainly, moving through the estate's corridors with the practiced calm of someone with legitimate business, though her heart pounded loud enough that she wondered briefly whether anyone passing nearby might somehow sense her nervous energy, despite her carefully composed expression. Corrin left for his meeting with Roland precisely on schedule, and moments later, Talia created her distraction, a sudden, urgent report of a minor injury among the kitchen staff that required immediate attention from Roland's personal guard, who left their posts near his private wing to investigate. The window of opportunity, though brief, gave Mira exactly the time she needed. She slipped into Roland's private study, through a side door Corrin had described in careful detail, her hands trembling slightly despite her determination to remain calm. The room was neat, orderly, nothing about its calm surface suggesting the dangerous ambitions hidden within its walls. She located the locked drawer exactly where Corrin had said it would be, and using a small tool Talia had provided, worked the lock open with careful, patient pressure until it finally gave way. Inside, she found exactly what they had hoped for, a leather-bound ledger, filled with Roland's own careful handwriting, recording payments to the surveillance firm across 3 years, along with detailed notes about the device's function and the information it had successfully gathered. Beneath the ledger, she found a folder of correspondence, letters exchanged with several council members sympathetic to his cause, outlining a careful plan to slowly erode confidence in Draven's leadership until his removal would seem not merely justified, but inevitable to the wider pack. Mira photographed each relevant page carefully, using a small camera Priya had loaned her for exactly this purpose, working as quickly as her shaking hands allowed, aware that every passing minute increased the risk of discovery. She had nearly finished when she heard footsteps approaching the study door, unhurried, but definitely drawing closer, and her heart leapt into her throat as she scrambled to return the ledger and folder to their exact original positions, closing the drawer and relocking it with fingers that felt clumsy with adrenaline. She had just enough time to slip behind a tall bookshelf near the room's far corner before the door opened, and Roland himself stepped inside, his expression distracted rather than suspicious, clearly still preoccupied with whatever Corin had told him during their meeting. Mira held perfectly still, her breath shallow and controlled, watching through a narrow gap between books as Roland crossed to his desk, retrieved a single document from a drawer she had not touched, and left the room again just as quickly as he had entered. She waited several long, agonizing minutes after the door closed, before finally allowing herself to move, her legs unsteady, as she slipped back through the side door and made her way carefully through the estate's quiet corridors, forcing her breathing back to something resembling normal, before anyone might see her and question her composure. By the time she reached Raven's study, where he and Talia waited anxiously for her return, she felt as though she had aged years in the span of a single evening. Draven pulled her into a tight embrace the moment she entered, relief evident in every line of his body, and Mira allowed herself a brief moment to simply breathe against his chest, before pulling back to share what she had found. She showed them the photographs on the small camera's screen, and the three of them pored over each image carefully, confirming that the evidence was exactly as damning as they had hoped. "We have everything we need now," Draven signed slowly, studying the photographed pages with an expression that mixed relief with grim determination. "Tomorrow, we bring this before the full council." Mira nodded, though a quiet unease still lingered beneath her relief. Roland was clever, resourceful, and had spent 3 years building his careful deception without ever once being caught. A man like that would not simply accept defeat quietly once his crimes were finally exposed, and as the four of them began planning the details of the following day's confrontation, Mira found herself praying that whatever Roland's next move might be, they would be prepared for it when it came. They spent the remainder of the night preparing carefully for the following morning's council session, organizing the photographed evidence into a clear, logical presentation, and deciding together exactly how the confrontation should unfold. Draven insisted that Corin be given the chance to speak honestly before the council about his own reluctant involvement, believing that a full and voluntary confession, rather than a forced exposure, would carry more weight and might allow Corin the possibility of eventual forgiveness rather than complete banishment. Talia, meanwhile, quietly gathered a handful of trusted senior pack members she believed could be relied upon to remain calm and rational once the shocking truth was revealed, understanding that Roland would almost certainly attempt to sway the room with denial and counter-accusations the moment he realized what was happening. Having allies prepared to support Draven's account from the very first moment felt essential to preventing the confrontation from dissolving into chaos. As dawn approached, Mira found a quiet moment alone with Draven in the study, both of them exhausted but too keyed up with nervous anticipation to consider sleep. She studied his face in the soft morning light, taking in the determination and lingering vulnerability written plainly across his features, and reached for his hand, holding it firmly. "Whatever happens today," she signed slowly, "you are not facing this as a broken man trying to prove himself. You are facing this as someone who survived a deliberate betrayal and uncovered the truth despite everything working against you. That is not weakness. That is strength. Most people will never be tested enough to discover in themselves." Draven's eyes softened, and he pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers in the same gesture he had used the day she left for the city weeks earlier. "Whatever the council decides today," he signed against her palm, "I am grateful beyond words that you were the one standing beside me when the truth finally came to light. I do not think I would have found it without you." They held each other quietly for a long moment, gathering strength from the closeness before the difficult day ahead, both of them aware that within hours, the careful, dangerous secret Roland had protected for 3 long years would finally be dragged into the light, and neither of them could yet predict exactly how far he might go to prevent that from happening. As the estate began stirring with the ordinary business of mourning, Mira made her way to the healer's workroom to collect Talia before the council session, only to find the older woman standing rigid near the doorway, her face pale with alarm. Talia gestured urgently for Mira to follow, leading her quickly down a side corridor, away from curious ears, before speaking in a low, tense whisper. "One of the kitchen staff just told me Roland's guards searched his study early this morning," she said, her eyes wide with worry. "They found the lock on his drawer slightly damaged, not enough to be obvious at a glance, but enough for someone who checks it daily to notice. Roland left the estate less than an hour ago, alone, without explanation, taking only a small bag with him." Mira's stomach dropped. If Roland had discovered the tampering, he might already suspect that his secret had been uncovered, which meant he could be fleeing entirely, taking crucial evidence with him, or worse, moving to eliminate the threat before it could reach the council at all. She hurried back to Draven's study, delivering the news as quickly as her hands could manage the necessary signs, watching his expression shift rapidly from concern to sharp, focused urgency. "We cannot wait for the scheduled session," he signed immediately. "If he has fled, we need to alert the council now, before he has time to gather allies or destroy further evidence. And we need guards searching the northern roads immediately, in case he intends to cross into the neighboring territory where his surveillance contacts operate." Draven moved quickly, summoning his most trusted guards and dispatching them toward the northern boundary, while simultaneously sending word to the council, demanding an emergency session within the hour, citing evidence of a serious threat to pack security that could not wait for the regularly scheduled meeting. Mira gathered the photographed evidence carefully, along with the physical device Priya had returned to her days earlier, ensuring everything was organized and ready to present the moment the council assembled. Corin, informed of the sudden change in plans, arrived at the study looking shaken but resolute, confirming that he had received no warning from Roland about any change in their arrangement, which suggested Roland's departure was a genuine panicked reaction to discovering the tampered lock, rather than a planned move against them. Still, his sudden absence left an unsettling uncertainty hanging over the entire situation, since no one could say for certain where he had gone, or what he intended to do next. As guards fanned out across the northern boundary, and word spread quietly through the estate that something significant was unfolding, Mira felt the weight of the coming confrontation settle heavily across her shoulders. Whatever calm, careful plan they had spent the night preparing had now collapsed into urgent, reactive action, and as she followed Draven toward the council chamber, evidence clutched carefully in her hands, she found herself hoping desperately that Roland's guards would locate him before he managed to disappear entirely, taking the last remaining pieces of a 3-year conspiracy with him into hiding. Word reached Draven just as the council members began filing into the chamber, a brief message relayed by one of the northern patrol guards, stating that Roland's vehicle had been spotted on the main road leading away from Pack territory, moving quickly toward the boundary that separated their lands from the neighboring territory where his surveillance contacts were known to operate. Draven read the message with a grim expression, sharing it quickly with Mira, before signing decisively that the council session would proceed exactly as planned, regardless of whether Roland himself could be brought back in time. "The truth needs to be told either way," he signed firmly. "If he runs, that is its own kind of confession. The council will understand what his absence means once they see the evidence for themselves." Mira nodded, steadying her nerves as they stepped through the chamber doors together, evidence in hand, ready to finally bring 3 years of carefully hidden betrayal into the full light of day, regardless of whether the man responsible chose to stand and face the consequences or flee into the shadows he had used so effectively for so long. The council chamber fell silent the moment Draven entered, the assembled elders and senior pack members exchanging uneasy glances at the unscheduled nature of the gathering, sensing immediately that something significant was about to unfold. Draven took his place at the head of the chamber, Mira standing close beside him, Corin and Talia positioned nearby, their presence itself a signal that today's session would be unlike any that had come before. Draven began, his hands moving with careful, deliberate precision as Corin translated aloud for the full room, explaining that 3 years ago, the injury that had cost him his hearing had not occurred during an ordinary border skirmish, as the pack had always been told, but had instead been the result of a deliberate act of betrayal, carried out and concealed by someone within their own leadership. Murmurs rippled through the chamber immediately, confusion and disbelief evident on many faces, and one elder near the front rose partway from his seat to demand clarification before Draven raised a hand, requesting patience, and continued laying out the evidence methodically, piece by piece, exactly as they had planned the night before. He described the discovery of the hidden device beneath his own skin, and Mira stepped forward at this point, holding up the tiny metallic object itself, along with photographs documenting the extraction procedure Talia had witnessed and could personally confirm. She explained, calmly and clearly, her nursing background lending weight and credibility to her account, exactly how the device had been found, and what its purpose had almost certainly been. Talia spoke next, confirming her own examination of the device and identifying it as sophisticated surveillance technology far beyond what any ordinary injury could explain, technology that required significant financial resources and specialized manufacturing to produce. A ripple of genuine alarm moved through the chamber now, the room's earlier skepticism giving way to something closer to dawning horror, as the pieces of the presentation began fitting together. Then came the photographed pages from Roland's private ledger, displayed carefully on a screen at the front of the chamber, showing his own handwriting recording payments to the surveillance firm across 3 full years, alongside correspondence detailing a careful, patient plan to erode confidence in Draven's leadership among sympathetic council members. Several of those very council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats as their own names appeared briefly within the correspondence, their expressions tightening with the realization that they had unknowingly been drawn into Roland's careful manipulation. Finally, Corin stepped forward, his hands shaking slightly as he addressed the room directly, offering his own honest confession of reluctant involvement, explaining how Roland's careful manipulation and subsequent threats against his family had drawn him into monitoring Draven's private conversations and passing information along through secret meetings. His voice, translated aloud by a second interpreter Talia had arranged in advance for exactly this moment, carried the unmistakable weight of genuine remorse, and though several council members frowned at his admission, none could deny the courage it took to stand before the full chamber and confess his own failures so openly. An elder finally spoke, his voice grave, asking the question that had clearly been building throughout the entire presentation. Where is Roland now, and why is he not here to answer for himself? Draven answered honestly, explaining that Roland had fled the estate that very morning upon discovering that his hidden ledger had been tampered with, and that patrol guards were currently attempting to intercept him before he crossed into the neighboring territory. The admission sent a fresh wave of murmurs through the chamber, and this time, the tenor of the room shifted unmistakably, skepticism giving way to genuine anger, directed not at Draven, but at the cousin who had betrayed the entire pack's trust for 3 long years, while hiding behind a mask of loyal concern. Just as the chamber's tension reached its peak, the doors at the rear of the room burst open, and one of the northern patrol guards entered quickly, moving toward Draven with an urgent message that he relayed through quick, careful signs. Roland had been intercepted at the boundary crossing, taken into custody without incident, and was currently being escorted back to the estate under guard, having offered no resistance once he realized the patrol had been specifically sent to find him. The news settled over the chamber with a heavy, complicated weight, relief mixing with lingering shock, as the full council began to absorb everything they had just witnessed. Draven waited until the murmurs settled once more before speaking his final words of the session, his hands moving with quiet, steady authority that commanded the room's full attention despite his inability to hear a single word being spoken around him. I did not bring this evidence before you today to seek pity, or even simply to clear my own name, he signed, Corin translating each word carefully. I brought it because this pack deserves leadership, built on honesty, and for 3 years, that honesty was stolen from all of us by someone we trusted. Whatever weakness my cousin claimed I possessed because of my hearing was never the true threat to this pack's stability. The true threat was a man patient enough to wait 3 years for an opportunity that honesty would never have given him. The chamber remained silent for a long moment after he finished, and then, slowly, One elder began to applaud, followed by another, until the sound spread through the room, in a wave of support that Draven could not hear, but could feel through the floor beneath his feet. A vibration of vindication, 3 long years in the making. Mira stood beside him, her chest tight with pride and relief, so overwhelming it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Watching the pack finally see her husband, exactly as she had seen him from the very beginning. Not as a broken man defined by what he could not hear, but as a leader whose patience and careful attention had ultimately uncovered a truth that louder, more careless men would have missed entirely. Roland arrived at the estate under guard less than an hour later, his usual polished composure entirely absent, replaced by a tight, furious expression that he could no longer bother to soften into false warmth now that his careful mask had finally been stripped away. He was brought directly into the council chamber, where the assembled elders waited with expressions ranging from cold anger to genuine grief at the betrayal of a man many of them had known since childhood. Draven faced his cousin from across the chamber, and for a long moment neither of them moved. 3 years of carefully hidden deception hanging heavy in the space between them. Finally, Roland spoke, his voice sharp with bitterness rather than any hint of remorse, and Corin translated his words carefully, though his hands moved with visible reluctance. "You were never fit to lead," Roland said, his eyes fixed on Draven with open contempt. "I did what was necessary to protect this pack from your weakness. Everything I did because someone needed to." The chamber erupted into outraged murmurs at the unapologetic admission, several elders rising fully from their seats in anger, but Draven raised a hand once more, requesting silence, and the room settled, watching him with rapt attention as he prepared his response. "My weakness," he signed slowly, letting Corin's translation carry the full weight of his calm, unwavering resolve, "was never my hearing. It was trusting family before earning proof of their loyalty. That is a mistake I will not make again. But it is a mistake, cousin, not a crime. What you did is a crime, plain and simple, and this council will decide your fate accordingly." Roland's jaw tightened, fury flashing across his face, but with guards positioned firmly at his sides, and the full weight of the council's judgment bearing down upon him, he had no further argument left to offer. The elders conferred briefly, their decision swift given the overwhelming evidence laid before them, and within the hour, Roland was formally stripped of his council position and confined under guard, pending a full tribunal, to determine the complete extent of his punishment. As guards led him from the chamber, Roland cast one final look back toward Draven and Mira, standing together near the front of the room, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face that might almost have been regret, quickly buried again beneath the same cold anger that had carried him this far. Then he was gone, and the chamber exhaled as one, the long shadow that had hung over the pack for 3 silent years finally, completely lifted. In the days that followed, the tribunal convened to determine Roland's full punishment, and Draven, though entitled to demand the harshest possible sentence, chose instead to advocate for permanent exile rather than execution, arguing before the council that the pack had already lost enough to Roland's ambition without also losing whatever remained of the family bond that had once existed between them. The council, respecting his judgment even in this final matter, agreed, and Roland was formally banished from pack territory, forbidden from ever returning under threat of far harsher consequences should he attempt it. Corin's fate proved a more complicated matter, and the council debated at length before ultimately deciding, largely on the strength of Draven's own testimony regarding his friend's voluntary confession and genuine remorse, that Corin would retain his position but under close, ongoing oversight, required to earn back the trust he had broken through consistent, transparent service to the pack over the coming years. Corin accepted the judgment with visible relief and gratitude, promising Draven privately that he intended to spend every remaining year of his service proving that his earlier betrayal did not define the whole of who he truly was. As the immediate chaos of the tribunal settled and pack life gradually began returning to its ordinary rhythms, Mira found herself reflecting on just how far she and Draven had come since that first strange meeting outside the hospital weeks earlier. What had begun as a desperate arrangement, a marriage born from necessity rather than affection, had transformed slowly and unexpectedly into something she now recognized, with quiet certainty, as genuine love, tested and proven through danger neither of them could have anticipated when they first exchanged vows in the estate's quiet stone hall. That evening, Draven found her once more in the garden beside the familiar fountain, the same quiet spot where so much of their story had unfolded over the past weeks, and he sat beside her without a word, taking her hand and holding it gently against his chest so she could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palm. "We did it," he signed slowly, once she looked up at him. "Together." Mira smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder as the evening light softened around them. "We did," she agreed. "And whatever comes next, I do not intend to face it any other way." Draven pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, and for the first time since the wager had first forced them together, neither of them felt the weight of an ending date hanging over their marriage. No 30-day deadline, no council demanding proof. Only the quiet, steady certainty of two people who had chosen each other freely, and who intended to keep choosing each other for many years still to come. 6 months passed before Pack territory finally felt, in Mira's own words, like something she could call home, rather than simply a place she was learning to survive within. The estate's rhythms had settled into something steadier and calmer than the tense, watchful atmosphere of her early weeks there, the shadow of Roland's betrayal fading slowly with each passing season, replaced gradually by a renewed sense of trust and stability that the Pack had not felt in years. Draven had used the months since the tribunal to rebuild the council's structure more carefully, introducing new oversight measures designed to prevent any single member from ever again accumulating the kind of unchecked influence Roland had exploited for so long. Several younger, more transparent leaders had risen into positions of responsibility, chosen for their integrity rather than mere seniority, and the shift had brought a new energy to Pack governance that even the older, more traditional elders had come to appreciate over time. Mira, meanwhile, had found her own place within the Pack, far beyond the role of simply the Alpha's wife. Working closely alongside Talia, she had helped establish a proper medical clinic within the estate, bringing modern nursing practices to a community that had previously relied almost entirely on traditional herbal remedies and inconsistent care. The clinic quickly became one of the Pack's most valued additions, and Mira found deep satisfaction in work that reminded her, every single day, why she had chosen nursing in the first place. A calling rooted in genuine care for the people around her rather than mere duty. Her mother, fully recovered from her earlier health scare, had visited Pack territory twice since the tribunal, charmed entirely by Draven's quiet warmth, and endlessly grateful for the security and comfort her daughter's marriage had ultimately provided. Security that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with the genuine partnership Mira had built with her husband. Corin had remained true to his promise, serving the Pack with a diligence and transparency that gradually, patiently rebuilt the trust he had once broken. Draven, though the wound of that particular betrayal never fully disappeared, found himself grateful for his old friend's continued presence at his side, understanding, in the wisdom that only difficult experience could teach, that people were capable of genuine redemption when given the chance to earn it honestly. Of Roland, little was heard after his exile. Only occasional rumors carried by travelers passing through neighboring territories, describing a man living a quiet, diminished life, far from the influence and power he had once so desperately craved. Draven, when he thought of his cousin at all, felt less anger now than a distant, complicated sadness for the family bond that ambition had ultimately destroyed, though he never once regretted the choice he had made to expose the truth, rather than allow the deception to continue. On a warm evening, marking exactly 1 year since their wedding, Draven arranged a quiet celebration in the same garden where so much of their story had unfolded, stringing soft lanterns through the trees surrounding the fountain, and Mira arrived to find him waiting there, alone, dressed simply, his expression carrying the same quiet warmth she had fallen in love with, somewhere along the winding, dangerous path their first year together had taken. He signed slowly as she approached, his hands steady, with a year's worth of practice and confidence that had grown far beyond the careful, hesitant signs of their earliest days together. 1 year ago, I married you to save my throne. I did not expect to fall in love. I did not expect you to save far more than my crown. Mira felt tears gather in her eyes, happy tears this time, entirely different from the fear and uncertainty that had marked so much of their first months together. You saved something in me too, she signed back, taking his hands in hers. I came here needing money for my mother's care. I found a partner who taught me that real strength has nothing to do with how loud someone can be, and everything to do with how carefully they choose to listen. Draven smiled, pulling her close, and for a long, quiet moment, neither of them needed words at all, signed or spoken, content simply to stand together beneath the soft lantern light, surrounded by the garden that had witnessed the slow, careful growth of their unlikely love from its very first tentative beginning. Later that evening, as they sat together beside the fountain, Draven reached into his coat and withdrew a small, wrapped item, offering it to her with a nervous energy that surprised her, given how far he had come from the guarded, careful man she had first met outside the hospital a year earlier. She opened it carefully to find a delicate bracelet, engraved along its inner edge with a phrase in the sign language he had patiently taught her over the past year. 3 simple words that needed no voice at all to carry their full and complete meaning. I hear you. Mira looked up at him, understanding immediately the depth of what those 3 words represented, an acknowledgement that despite everything the world had taken from him, despite years of being underestimated and finally betrayed by someone who should have protected him most, he had found, in her, someone whose presence he trusted completely, someone who had proven, through danger and patience and unwavering loyalty, that she would always stand beside him no matter what challenges still lay ahead. She fastened the bracelet around her wrist and pulled him into a kiss beneath the lantern light, and somewhere in the packed territory beyond the garden walls, the estate settled into peaceful evening quiet, no longer haunted by hidden devices or careful betrayals, but resting instead in the steady, hard-won security of a leader and his wife who had faced the darkest truth of his past together and emerged from it stronger, wiser, and more deeply in love than either of them could have imagined possible on the strange, tense day their marriage had first begun. Years later, pack members would still tell the story of the deaf Alpha King who had married a stranger to save his throne, and of the sharp-eyed nurse who had discovered, hidden beneath old scar tissue, proof of a betrayal 3 years in the making. They would tell of council chambers filled with gasps and outrage, of a cousin exiled for his ambition, and of a friendship nearly broken but ultimately mended through honesty and grace. But mostly, they would remember the ending, the simple, quiet truth at the heart of the entire story, that the greatest strength any leader could possess was not the ability to hear every whispered threat, but the willingness to trust the right person enough to listen with everything else he had, and that sometimes, the person willing to look closely enough to save you was standing right in front of you the whole time, waiting patiently to be noticed. Mira herself never grew tired of hearing the story retold, though she always insisted, with a gentle laugh, that the pack remember the truth accurately, that Draven had never once needed saving in the way the stories sometimes suggested, that he had simply needed someone patient enough to notice what everyone else had overlooked, and steady enough to stand beside him once the truth finally came to light. He had built the strength to survive 3 years of hidden betrayal entirely on his own, long before she ever arrived, and she considered it the greatest privilege of her life, simply to have been trusted enough to help him carry that weight into the light. Talia, now recognized throughout the pack as one of its most respected voices, often remarked that the clinic Mira had built stood as its own quiet monument to everything that had changed since that difficult first year, a place where care and attentiveness mattered more than tradition alone, much like the marriage that had first brought modern nursing practices into pack territory in the first place. Young pack members training under her guidance learned not only medical skills but also the deeper lesson Mira herself had carried since her earliest days at the estate, that healing often began with careful observation long before it ever reached a patient's actual wound. Corin, in the years that followed, eventually earned a position of genuine trust once more, and on quiet evenings, he could sometimes be found teaching young pack children the beginnings of sign language, ensuring that the next generation would never again view Draven's silence as anything other than another form of strength, another way of understanding the world that deserved neither pity nor doubt. And Draven and Mira themselves continued on together, ruling the pack not through fear or unchecked authority, but through the same careful partnership that had first uncovered the truth, hidden beneath old scar tissue, on a quiet evening, in his private study. Their marriage, born from a desperate wager and a 30-day deadline, had long since become something far more enduring, proof to the entire pack that the truest unions were built not on grand declarations, but on the quiet, daily choice to trust, to listen, and to stand beside one another through whatever darkness the world tried to place in their path. On the anniversary of the day the truth had finally come before the council, Draven made it a quiet tradition to walk the estate grounds alone at dawn, pausing at the northern boundary where the strange intrusion had first set their investigation into motion so long ago. He would stand there in the early light, feeling the ground settle beneath his feet, grateful not for the danger itself, but for everything it had ultimately revealed, about his pack, about the people he could truly trust, and about the woman who had walked into his silent world and refused to let him face any of it alone. Mira usually joined him partway through these quiet mornings, finding him exactly where she expected, and together they would walk back toward the estate, as the sun rose fully over the trees, hand in hand, saying little, because little needed to be said between two people who had already proven, through fire and fear and careful patient investigation, that whatever life asked of them next, they would face it together, exactly as they had chosen to on that very first strange and hopeful day, outside a crowded city hospital. The pack thrived in the years that followed, stronger and more united than it had been in generations, led by a king who listened more carefully than any before him, and a queen who had taught an entire community that true strength was never about how loudly a person could speak, but about how deeply they were willing to look, how patiently they were willing to wait, and how fiercely they were willing to fight for the truth once they finally found it.